Hello, and welcome to Edinburgh Skeptics in Lockdown. My name's Heather, and we're here tonight with one of our committee members, Sean Slater, to talk to us about pseudoscience. We're going to start doing a few more of these online events as the lockdown continues and while we still can't meet in person. If you want to support us in any way while we're still offline, you can find us on Patreon. We do have one of those, even though we have no patrons, but you could be our first. But we're doing fine for money, though, so there are plenty of other good causes that you could give to at this time. So we're not begging and pleading because we're fine. So tonight we're going to talk about 5G pseudoscience, and I believe that Sean has done some recent stuff into all the new bollocks that's come out around coronavirus. So if you've seen the talk before, there should hopefully be something new for you. And like I say, keep an eye out on our social media and we'll update you when we've got a new thing coming out in the next few weeks. And I'll hand over to Sean. Bye for now.
Hi, thanks Heather, thanks very much. Good evening. So I'm Sean Slater. I'm the Vice Chair of Edinburgh Skeptics. Some of you may already know me. I work in the mobile industry and I have done for over 25 years, something like that. So initially a disclaimer. Although I work in the mobile industry and I work for a mobile phone company, for a network, in fact, I'm not here representing them in any way, shape or form. So if anybody knows which company I work for, it's irrelevant. I'm here talking about my own knowledge on the business of the industry and as a skeptic as well and what I've studied. So that aside, let's get cracking. So 5G, it's scary according to what you find on the internet. Very scary. It's a military-grade weapon. It's going to murder you. It's all this radiation is causing cancer and all sorts of scary things. And these are just some memes that I found on Facebook and Twitter when I first started doing this talk, and that was over a year ago. So it's nothing new. In fact, from there, it spread out into the real world. So within about 2018, we started seeing things like this. We started seeing people doing campaigns, getting themselves out there in the public, trying to stop 5G in the local area. And of course, when that happens, it spreads on Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it and all the other social media places. So, I mean, these are just a quick search for 5G groups on Facebook, and you'll find hundreds of them. Some are pretty popular. There's one there, 5G network microwave radiation dangers, 180 posts a day. Halt 5G in the UK and Ireland, 700 posts a day. I think many skeptics groups would kill for that sort of publicity. So it's been really prevalent and has been for at least 2 years. So when it spreads from Facebook and from local areas, it gets in the local newspapers. So you'll find lots of these articles in lots of newspapers, and I culled these from, I think, a couple of weeks in early 2019. So this was from various newspapers like the Stroud Times or the Bristol Post and all sorts of things. You know, fears people in Bristol are at risk of cancer from Vodafone 5G. Well, just Vodafone? What about the rest? Maybe they're fine. I don't know. Health fears over new 5G phone masts. So it's out there in the public and has been for quite a while. So long before coronavirus came along, people were very scared about this. Interestingly, I want to show this clip. This is this one of the posts from one of the articles from the Bristol newspaper. And the subheadline is, "One doctor called 5G the stupidest idea anyone has had in the history of the world." That sounds pretty scary to me. And if it's a real doctor and one that you maybe put some faith in, then that would be quite dangerous and quite scary. Now, that phrase was also uttered by Tonia Antonianazzi, who's the MP for Gower in South Wales. And she led a debate in March 2019 in Parliament in what's called the Westminster Hall debates, which is a kind of separate area where MPs can have debates rather than in the main chambers. And she led a debate about the unintended consequences of the 5G rollout. And she also quoted that particular quote about the stupidest idea in the history of the world. And if you go to 5G groups on Facebook and Twitter and all the rest of it like I do, and if you have arguments with them online, you'll see that quote spread quite a lot. It's very popular for some reason, and I'm not sure why. But the guy that uttered it is this guy. This is Professor Martin Paul, who's a professor emeritus of biochemistry and basic medical sciences at Washington State University. But the full quote is, putting in tens of millions of 5G antennas without a single biological test of safety has got to be about the stupidest idea anyone has had in the history of the world. I could think of lots more stupid ideas, but, let's not go there. Now, this came from an article that he published, self-published article that blamed not just 5G, but 4G, 3G, 1G, half G, whatever Gs you want to mention. He talked about Wi-Fi, he talked about electromagnetic waves in general being the causes of all sorts of diseases and so on. His speciality, Martin Paul's speciality, is actually in chronic fatigue syndrome. He's written lots and lots of papers about chronic fatigue syndrome. And he focuses on the mechanisms of chronic inflammatory diseases and how various stressors initiate causes of such disease. So his bugbear is basically Wi-Fi and radio frequencies in general. He claims that they have a direct impact on our health. And he claims to have evidence to show it, but it's rejected by a vast majority of the medical profession. So I want to talk about this guy. Apologies there, skipped a couple. This is Mark Steele. Some of you may already know Mark. He was interviewed by Michael Marshall on the Be Reasonable podcast a couple of years ago. And he was one of the first people in the UK to really come to prominence as an anti-5G campaigner. It's certainly when I first heard that there was a lot of scaremongering about 5G. And in 2018, spring or so, 2 years ago now, he tried to campaign to have Gateshead Council stop putting up what he called 5G LED streetlights. He claimed they cause cancer, insomnia, nosebleeds, miscarriages, and all sorts of things. He claimed that Gateshead Council was holding secret 5G Wi-Fi trials at fire. And in the end, Gateshead Council had to put out a publicity post to say that this was absolute bullshit. This is the post they put out on Facebook and their own Facebook page, claiming that, or stating for the fact that Gateshead Council does not use 5G technology in any of its streetlights or in any capacity. It has never done so. The streetlights in Gateshead will not give you cancer. The streetlights will not induce miscarriages in pregnant women. Gateshead Council is not carrying out secret government trials. It seems remarkable that a local authority had to do that, but they did. And part of the problem is Mark Steele didn't stop. He carried on harassing and accusing Gateshead Council of all sorts of things. He started harassing individual councillors, and in the end, they had to take out an injunction to stop him doing it. What Gateshead Council were actually doing is actually fairly simple to find out. It was a thing called the LeafNut Wireless Central Management System. And Gateshead Council, like many councils up and down the land, are trying to, one, save money, and two, save the environment. So cut down on the carbon footprint. So they had a £6 million contract with a company called LeafNut, who installed a combination of GPS and FM radio frequency lights that ran off LED. So they used up a hell of a lot less power than traditional sodium streetlights. They were controlled individually because they had a tiny transmitter on the top that transmitted a very small amount of wireless radiation to a home base, equivalent of 80 seconds a week at less than 1% of the safe exposure limit set by the authorities. It wasn't 5G, nothing to do with 5G. It was running off an FM radio frequency. It was unused. But it allowed the council to cut their costs quite substantially by not only using LEDs instead of sodium lights. They could then control the brightness of those lights for when it was dark and foggy, or when it was just dusk, where they could control individual street lights instead of whole swathes of the town being turned on at the same time when they weren't needed. And all in all, it was a pretty good thing. But Mark Steele seemed to have this bugbear that LEDs put out some sort of strange radiation. But all of this stuff that's been shared on lots of places like Facebook and all the rest of it, there is a lot of chatter that it's been spread in the background by Russia Today. Russia Today have done dozens of pretty popular videos on YouTube on their American show, not on the Russian show. In Russia Today, 5G is a good thing because Putin likes it. He wants Russia to catch up with the West and China and Japan by rolling out a good 5G infrastructure. And he's trying to hold back what the rest of the world is doing, what we're doing in Europe and in America. So Russia Today is putting out lots and lots of videos, pretty subtle videos, but nonetheless claiming that 5G is an experiment on humanity. It's an unreported global threat, and corporations push dangerous 5G. And there are dozens and dozens of these with hundreds of thousands of views. I mean, that top one you may be able to see has 2 million views. And that was from just a year ago. So it's been spread like wildfire, and to my opinion, it's been spread deliberately. But so, where did the link between 5G and coronavirus start? That's the next thing I want to talk about. Well, actually, you need to go back to quite early in the whole coronavirus pandemic. On January the 22nd, a Belgian newspaper called Het Laatste Nieuws, pardon my Flemish, published an interview with a guy called Chris van Kerkhoven, who's a doctor from Antwerp. And he claimed, which is what that headline is translated as, is 5G is life-threatening and no one knows it. And in the subheading underneath, you can maybe see that, it says, link with coronavirus, ? So according to Wired, I took the translation that Wired published, the journalist pointed out that since 2019, a number of 5G cell towers had been built around Wuhan. Could the two things be related? Asked the journalist. I have not done a fact check, said Van Kerkhoven, but it may be a link with current events. And that basically lit the fuse. That was the first mention or the first link on the internet between 5G and coronavirus. And that was pretty quickly picked up by a lot of anti-5G Facebook groups in Holland and in Belgium, and eventually found its way into our old friend InfoWars. So InfoWars, you may be able to see that date, is on January the 30th, 2020. 5G launches in Wuhan weeks before coronavirus outbreak. So this is pretty early in the pandemic. This is before we'd had any cases, or at least substantial cases in the West. Certainly all the publicity in January was about it spreading in China, and would it spread elsewhere? So even before it had hit us, conspiracy mongers were already linking 5G and coronavirus. And it didn't stop there. It starts spreading on all these Facebook groups. So once it gets into the English language, it starts spreading in all the English language news groups and Facebook groups and all the rest of it. Pretty soon it's impossible to stop. But it's still fairly contained within those groups. It's not spreading to the public at the moment. But things like the Waking News, which is a kind of mind, body, spirit type, or Waking Times, I should say, they started talking about 5G and the conspiracy, and 5G and the China epidemic. Dr. Darrell Wolfe wrote about, on March the 18th, wrote about coronavirus being a 5G prison for children. This is on a YouTube video with nearly 100,000 views. And of course, eventually it came into the public realm. The rest of the public kind of realised that this was a thing. This is an article, a headline from the Daily Mail. Conspiracy theories post video of herself calling bemused workers killers for laying 5G fibre optic cables that she wrongly claims are cause of coronavirus. Typical Daily Mail headline, 500 words, it basically covers the whole article. So that was, many of you have probably seen that video of a woman just harassing two bemused cable layers in the middle of some back street in London, being accused of poisoning children by their 5G waves. And that's kind of where it jumped into the mainstream. And from there, it started being really spread by not just anti-vaxxers, when they're linking to Bill Gates, anti-globalists and anti-GMO, big pharma, all these usual suspects. And again, an alt-med practitioner called Dr. Thomas Cowan, MD, on March the 11th at a conference in Tucson called the Health and Human Rights Summit, he claimed that coronavirus is a result of poisoning caused by 5G. And please note that not Dr. Andrew Wakefield was headlining that conference. So you see that symmetry and that connection between anti-vaxxers, the anti-globalists thinking that Bill Gates is out to kill everyone, and of course 5G. Robert Kennedy Jr., the grandson of JFK, claimed on the 30th of March that the lockdown stopped people protesting against 5G robber barons from microwaving our country and destroying nature. And then the very famous David Icke video, COVID-19 and 5G, what's the connection? Of course, he claimed there was a connection, and that had 500,000 views on YouTube before YouTube eventually got round to removing it. From there, it then spread by lots of celebrities. Things like the boxer Amir Khan, Anne Marie, Woody Harrelson, and TV personalities like Amanda Holden and Eamon Holmes. And once they're spreading it, it becomes, in the public realm, everybody thinks it's true, or many people think it's true. And up to date, over 90 phone masts have now been attacked during the UK coronavirus lockdown, which is palpably ridiculous. Many of those phone masts, and I would say probably the bulk of those phone masts, were not putting out 5G signals. Many of those phone masts would have covered people who were shielding, who might no longer have a mobile phone or have a home phone. And the only way of communication to get medicines or to get support was via their mobile. That's what most people use. How many of you now still use your home phone? Have your phone numbers and so on stored, or people have your home phone? It's very rare. So it's pretty dangerous and stupid conspiracy. Fortunately, much of it has been taken down, or I say much, some of it has been taken down. Some of the more prominent stuff has been taken down by YouTube. But Facebook isn't stopping any of these. There are hundreds of these videos on Facebook. A brief search will find them. So, you know, from a fairly niche conspiracy to a fairly ridiculous conspiracy, this whole pandemic has thrown it into the limelight, and it now becomes a fairly popular conspiracy, and a dangerous one at that. So let's start at the beginning. Why is it a conspiracy? Why is it ridiculous? Why do people, or what are even people talking about? What is 5G? So we need to start as what do we mean by the Gs? Now, this astounded me when I talk to people about this. Some people don't even know that Gs simply stands for generations. So a bit like this kind of generational names in America, that, you know, the baby boomers and the Generation X and all that. There's no hard and fast line. It's pretty much a continuum or a spectrum. It's generational steps in cell phone technology. So as cell phone technology has improved over the last 30 plus years, the networks kind of split those into about 10-year cycles, and they bring out a new generation of technology. Usually when the change is sufficient to warrant that designation. As I'll show you in a minute, a lot of those steps are fairly minor. Sometimes they're major. There are some leaps, and it's roughly every 10 years, but it's as much about marketing as it is about specific advances. At the end of the day, mobile phone companies want to sell you a phone, and they want to sell you the latest shiny gadgets. So do the manufacturers. You know, Apple want you to buy the latest iPhone. So do Samsung and Huawei or however the hell you pronounce it. They want to sell you the latest phone, and they're not going to do that unless you think that the new one is better than the old one. So much like new improved washing powder generally is better than washing powder 30 years ago, a lot of the leaps are about marketing as much about anything else. But, caveat, there are improvements and sometimes there are leaps. So let's have a look at those generations and see how much they have leapt. So 1G, it wasn't known as 1G then. There was a bit like the Second World War. Sorry, the First World War was not called the First World War until the Second World War happened. 1G was just known as mobile phone technology. But it was an analog network. It was from about the early 80s in the UK. There was very little data transmission. Now, at the bottom on the slide, you'll see 1G 1979. What that means is in 1979, this is kind of when the formats were first talked about. So a little bit like a computer language. You need to have a particular format or a particular language for mobile phones to talk to the base stations, to talk to the mast, and to talk to the network. There are more efficient ways of doing that. And as the technology improves, as computing power improves, so does the ability for the amount of data and the amount of information carried by that radio signal to be increased. So in the early days, there was basically a few different formats, a few different procedures, but generally speaking, they were fairly simple and not that many. So along came 2G in, so let me go to the next one. So along came 2G in the early 1990s. Now this time there was a big leap. There was a big leap from 1G to 2G because it was now digitized. So instead of sending an analog signal, it's now all zeros and ones, whatever. Everything's digital. So that was a big leap. There was no doubt about it. But now, because it's digitized, that means that you can transfer and receive data and information much, much more efficiently. So that left spare data on the network for text messaging. So by now it's 100% secure. You don't have the problems with analog, which wasn't very secure. You've got the growth of BlackBerry. You've got data transmission around about 0.5 to 1 megabit per second. But you also had lots of different systems and different processes. In the 2G, you've got all these ones I mentioned. I'm not even going to go through all the acronyms because they're ridiculous. But you also have transitional. So because the technology was rapidly improving, computing power was moving on in leaps and bounds in the early 90s and the mid 90s. So by the end of that decade, you had GPRS and Edge, which some of you may know about. You had these different processes and procedures that worked really, really well. They were called 2.5G, 2.75G, until eventually 3G. And everybody knew 3G would be the next step forward. And a different procedure was invented for that one. So 3G came out in 2003. You had a data transmission of around 2 to 7 megabits per second. It was a little bit better. But you've now got enough capacity for data, sending pictures and camera phones and internet and all the rest of it. But if you notice, there are a hell of a lot more procedures and different ways of transmitting the data. You've got CDMA, you've got UMTS, eventually you've got transitional 3.5G, 3.75, 3.9G. It's getting better and better all the time throughout the decade. But one of the problems is you've got systems in Europe are different from the systems in the United States, which are different from the systems in Japan and Korea. And at that point, in early 3G phones, you couldn't take your phone to Japan and use it there because their networks worked on different systems. So you may be able to take it to the United States because a lot of the phones were manufactured to work with US and Europe, but weren't manufactured to work with Japan. And that created a bit of a problem because lots of people like to travel, and also the manufacturers didn't want to have to make loads of different devices for different networks in different countries. They would rather have a consistent format. So what then happened when 4G came out, which was in the early 2010s, you've now got only a few different systems, LTE Advanced, LTE Advanced Pro, WiMAX, and so on. So you have much less processes to transmit and receive the data. It was much, much, much more efficient than it was in the early days. But because you've got a consistent format, it means that you can take the device anywhere in the world and you know it's going to work. So by 4G, you've got decent speeds up to 20 to 50 megabits per second. You've got full internet browsing. Some of you may be watching this on a 4G connection. I've no idea. So 5G. 5G is hopefully going to have speeds of up to 1 gigabit per second. It's going to be a hell of a lot quicker. You've got a lot lower latency. What that means is when you transmit data and receiver responds, the difference between that is called latency. And it means that time is cut down quite substantially. It means you can have proper control because you've got that data transfer and reception much quicker. It's still using existing spectrum. So throughout all these different generations, you're still using the same spectrum of radio frequencies. You're not changing to make it a higher frequency or a lower frequency. You're still using the same radio waves across all these generations. Where the improvements are coming from is in the advances of other technology like the chips inside the phones, the amount of information it can store itself on the network, all the switches and all the rest of it, the improvements in them that enable the networks and the more efficient use of the spectrum is getting better and better and better over all those generations. So it's nothing to do with changing the radio waves. You're not boosting the radio waves. You're not making them stronger or lighter. You're still using the same radio waves. You're just using different technology on those radio waves. It's still the same thing. So in 5G, similar to 4G, you only have a couple of different processes. One of the main ones to remember is IMT 2020, which is under development right now. And IMT 2020 is called International Mobile Telecommunications 2020 Standard. And what that will allow is all these different devices to basically use the same language, to use the same way of communicating with each other, so that you don't have all these different ways. It's about like having a standard format of Wi-Fi. Everybody knows that Wi-Fi is the same throughout the world. There's a couple of different standards, but let's not go there. But basically, Wi-Fi is Wi-Fi throughout the world, and the idea is to have that as well for 5G, so you have the same standard, and it's very efficient. So that's basically what 5G is. That's basically how the networks have improved. But what about the hardware? So are there any changes to the hardware and the network design that allows 5G to be slightly different from the other generations? Well, one of the ways it's going to work is probably going to use smaller cells and what's called picocells. So these are fairly small cells that will be no much bigger or not cover a bigger area than perhaps a kilometre square. So having all those small cells allows you to cover a much wider area with more frequencies. It means the frequency in one cell a mile away can be different from the one that's a mile away from that, which is a mile away from that, and all have different frequencies. If you have one big mast that covers a town, you are limited to the amount of frequencies that that mast can put out. So having small cells means better coverage, but it also means the cells themselves can be much lower power. So they're actually putting out a lot less radio frequency than having one big cell. So 10 small cells will cover about the same area, but will put out less power. So it actually slightly better if you're worried about radio frequency. You want more smaller cells rather than one big large cell. And the good thing about this, it will provide a higher data rate because you've got many more cells. It means you're not having to cover so many people. And it'll mean to a lower latency network as well. This other thing that we're talking about is called massive Mimo. I have heard this bundled about saying Mimo itself stands for massive something, but it doesn't. It stands for multiple input, multiple output. Now, anybody that works in computer science will probably be familiar with that term. Essentially, it's having lots of ways in and lots of ways out. So lots of ways for the wireless signal to reach the switch, and lots of ways for that wireless signal to go back to your mobile phone. So instead of having one connection, you could have 2, 3, or 4 connections or antennas on your phone itself. So multiple antennas on your phone, similarly multiple antennas on the masts themselves. Gives you much more capacity, gives you much more spectrum, much more bandwidth. It means people can, many more people can use the same cell. And if you have a large number of miniature-sized antenna arrays like that, like is shown on here on the slide, you're going to cover an awful lot more people. The other thing I want to talk about is full duplex mode of transmission. You know, when you use a walkie-talkie, you've probably seen people on the telly using a walkie-talkie. You've got to press the button and say over, and then you let go so that you can hear the response. Then when you want to talk, you press the button, so you transmit, you let go to receive. That is called duplex. Duplex in a mobile phone works the same way, but to get round that problem on a traditional mobile phone, it has two different, slightly different frequencies. So when you make a call on your mobile phone, it will transmit your voice on one frequency and receive the response on a slightly different frequency. So that means 2 pieces of bandwidth are being used by your phone. If you could do both sending and receiving on the same piece of bandwidth, that frees up other areas of the spectrum for other people. So it means you can have more people using the same mast. Now, traditionally, that's very difficult to do, but because computing power is improving and technology is improving, you can have very high-speed switches that allow you to control that data transfer in each direction really, really efficiently. So you won't actually notice it, but because the switches are getting better, again, it means making more efficient use of the current spectrum that we have. So lastly, beamforming. Beamforming is an interesting, fairly new technology. And what it does is the masts themselves are able to direct the signal. And it can track where you are, not for any nefarious purposes, but only because it can work out, using algorithms, where that beam needs to go to. So if you're heading west or whatever, or a certain direction from the mast, the beam can roughly go in your direction. Now, if you're doing that, if that beam is narrow, that means you can have a different signal using the same piece of spectrum going in a different direction, so the opposite direction, say. So that can be going to John Smith, and that can be going to Mary Jones at the back. So traditionally, you can't do that because a mast will put most things out in the same direction, which means that you can't have more than one person using the same spectrum. So all these things allow multiple users on the same spectrum and allows much faster communication. And although the beam is narrow, it's still the same signal strength. It just happens to be narrower. It doesn't have to dissipate so quickly. It reduces the amount of radio frequency in any one particular spot. So if you're on the receiving end of that piece of radio signal, you're still getting what you would have done had it been a wider one, but just people around it are no longer getting that piece of radio signal. So interestingly, on beamforming, one of the things a lot of 5G or anti-5G proponents warn about is that 5G is what they call a weapons-grade technology. And you see memes like this all over the internet as well, that it's going to beyond Orwellian military-grade technology, and it's going to use 3D Mimo multi-beamforming using new 5G smartphones as weapons. So I kind of looked into this. I thought, what the hell are they talking about? Why are they equating what is a civilian technology with a military grade, and what do they mean by that? So what I found out was there's a thing that the American military invented called the Active Denial System, or ADS. And this is a non-lethal directed energy weapon that the US military invented as a form of crowd control. To my knowledge, it's never been used in the US. Hopefully never will be, but anyway, who knows? I think pretty sure it's been abandoned because it didn't really work very well anyway. It was only ever used and tried in the Middle East, in Afghanistan and Iraq. But what it does is it fires a very, very high-powered beam. Now, remember that beamforming? So it narrows the beam. So the technology in this, as far as I know, is probably what's driven the idea of beamforming in the 5G mast. So maybe, I think this is where they're coming from. So anyway, this active denial system fires a high-powered beam of 95 gigahertz waves at target. 95 gigahertz is way, way higher and much more higher energy than mobile phone signals, but that's by the by. But even then, even with this big mast and it's firing at you very, very close, the heat that's generated by this radio waves only penetrates the top layers of skin, and it only penetrates less than half a millimeter. And I read an article of a journalist who'd experienced it in, I can't remember where it was, but anyway, he experienced it and he wrote about his experiences of it. And he said, for the first millisecond, it felt just like the skin was warming up. Then it got warmer and warmer, and you felt like it was on fire. But as soon as you're away from that beam, your skin returns to normal and there's no more pain. So it can cause localized burning if left exposed for some time, but it's a fairly immediate heat. But like standing in front of a fire, I'm going to assume, but a very localized area of your skin that's been with a sensation on it. But as I said, it didn't work very well because people tend to move around in a crowd, and it kind of didn't work very well, and I just don't think it's ever been used to any extent. But that's what I think they're talking about when they say it's a weapons-grade technology. So let's move on to some of the science. Excuse me. So are these concerns even plausible? Now, bear in mind, I'm not a scientist. I haven't even got a science O grade. So please forgive me, any scientists watching this, if I talk bollocks. I have talked to scientists, and I've read quite a few science tracks on this, so I think I understand it. Hopefully, my understanding I can pass on to you. But, warning, I'm not a scientist, and I am trying to science. So that in mind, that caveat in mind, let's start at the beginning. This charming gentleman is Heinrich Rudolf Hertz. He was the first person to prove conclusively that electromagnetic waves exist. So a Hertz is what was named after him, is 1 cycle per second. So radio waves move in a wave, exactly why they're called radio waves. And he deemed that one movement of that wave from the peak to the peak is 1 Hertz. So if it moves at 100, if it moves past a fixed point at 100 times per second, that is 100 Hertz. If it moves past it 1,000 times per second, it is a kilohertz. If it moves past it 1,000,000 times per second, it is a megahertz. At 1,000 million, it's a gigahertz, and so on and so forth. Excuse me. So it was his notation that talked about those waves. So it's exactly the same with sound waves are measured in hertz. Waves on the sea can be measured in hertz. Anything that moves in a wave pattern can indeed move can indeed be classed as a hertz if it moves at 1 hertz per second. So that in mind, we're going to talk about basically megahertz and gigahertz. So bear in mind, that's kind of what I'm going to talk about, and a gigahertz is 1,000 megahertz. So this is the electromagnetic spectrum, a fairly basic design for the electromagnetic spectrum. You've got radio waves at one end, and you've got gamma rays at the other end. In middle, you've got visible light. This is not to scale, I hasten to add. So radio waves are very long wavelength, so the difference between the peaks is called the wavelength. The frequency that they move over you is the number of hertz. That is the times where the peak of one wave hits you. And they're very, very low energy. They don't have much energy at all. At the other end, gamma rays are very, very short wavelength. They're extremely high frequency, bearing in mind that these waves are moving at the speed of light. And they contain a hell of a lot more energy than the waves at the other end. So you've got to bear these things in mind. So on that, I'm going to look at that spectrum in a little bit more detail. Now, apologies if the slide is a little bit complicated looking, especially if you're looking at it on a fairly small screen, but hopefully you can get some information out of it. So at the top, you can see the wavelength, the difference between the peaks of the wave. They can go from the size of a football field, it's an American chart, so it talks about an American football field, but you get the picture, a man's height, a baseball, right down to an atomic nucleus. So the ones at the far end on the right are have much, much, much higher energy. The ones at the bottom have very, very, very low energy and can pass through things. So we split these things up. We split all this electromagnetic energy into two things: ionizing radiation on the right and non-ionizing radiation on the left. And as you see there, the output of light in the middle is a tiny, tiny amount of the spectrum. That is non-ionizing radiation, but just above that, ultraviolet and above, is ionizing radiation. Now, what that does, it has the capability to essentially rip electrons from atoms. And when it does that, it has the capability on living tissue of causing DNA damage. Essentially, it will give you cancer. The higher up that spectrum, the more energy it has, the more likely it is to give you cancer. So X-rays, you can have a medical X-ray, but obviously you need to take care because long-term exposure is enough to give you cancer. If you start getting cosmic rays, gamma rays, you're likely to get cancer pretty quickly. Either that turn green, I don't know, and be very, very big. But on the left, the non-ionizing radiation, you go down to the radio spectrum. On right at the bottom is the kind of useful stuff. This is the stuff that we use for human beings have made use of this for communications, and it works really, really well because it's very, very low power, but it's enough that we can hear it. We can send out a little signal into the world, and it can be picked up by a device somewhere else. We've learned to do that. We've learned to do that basically over 120 years. Marconi was doing this over 100 years ago. And we've got better and better and better and better at it, and more understanding of how this works. So let's zoom in on the radio frequency. So just talking about narrowing down our talk to the radio frequency that we're talking about. So you can go from very low frequency at around 3 kilohertz, 3000 hertz, right up to 300 gigahertz. Now that's just the radio frequency. Similarly to how the whole spectrum works, it works the same at a smaller level as well. On the left, you've got you've got very low power, and because of that, it can carry a long way. So you've got increasing range. You've got lots of range with the radio frequency at that level. At the other end, you've got very little range, or much less range compared to what you have at low frequency. However, on the right, it can carry an awful lot more information, because you've got more pieces of, more cycles per second, more information. So essentially with radio waves, you've got better penetration and coverage at one end, or more capacity and information at the other end. So there's a sweet spot in the middle. There's a nice sweet spot around about 300 megahertz to 3 gigahertz, where we can make use of that. And we use that a lot for TV to carry a lot of data, but it also carries a long way. It carries far enough to be useful. So let's zoom in on that sweet spot a little bit more and look at mobile phones, see how they're being used. So mobile phones in the UK, you've got 4 networks: EE, O2, 3, and Vodafone. Any of the other networks that you may have heard of, like Tesco Mobile or Giftgaff or SM, they still use one of these 4 networks for their infrastructure. So these are the only 4 networks in the UK. This is the frequency that they all use, which is between 700 megahertz and 3,400 megahertz, or 3.4 gigahertz. So as you can see, most of that stuff in the middle, 1800 and 2100, is traditional 2G, 3G, 4G. And you've got the ones at either end, which 700 and 3400, going to be used for 5G. Potentially, you've got 24 gigahertz or 24,000 megahertz may be used in the future for 5G. And this is what a lot of people are scared about or campaigning against, is the use of that. But it's still well below ionizing radiation. It is not dangerous. We already use 24 gigahertz for other things. It's just going to be repackaged for mobile phone technology. But because that has less penetration and coverage, you need more mass. So this is what they talk about when they say they need more mass. If we use 24 gigahertz, yes, we will need more mass. If we use the 700 megahertz, which is what they're currently using or starting to roll out on, we don't need as many mass. Apart from, we've already talked about having lots of little nano picocells and so on. Interestingly, that 700, 800, and 900 megahertz is what we used to use for analog TV. Analog TV was switched off in most of the UK a few years ago, and the power output of some of those masts was absolutely massive compared to mobile phones. Mobile phones use about 1 watt of power, a tiny amount. TV masts, large TV masts up on a hill covered basically the whole of central Scotland or the whole of Yorkshire or the whole of London or whatever in one mast, they could put out over 100,000 watts of power. So 100,000 times more powerful of the same radio frequency that mobile phones are putting out. But you haven't heard of campaigners campaigning against that for a long time. So if we plot those on our chart, so the yellow is what we currently use, the red is what the planned rollout of 5G if we do use that higher frequency. So it's still well within non-ionizing radiation band. The blue is actually where most satellite TV is broadcasted from. So we're already using similar bandwidth for satellite TV above our heads. We just don't talk about that either. So if you go to Ofcom's website, you can access this interesting little series of charts. They have all these little charts for all the different bandwidths and ranges that are licensed in the UK. Now, I've just called 2. I've called one from 1.7 to 2.7 gigahertz, another one from 14 to 29 gigahertz. And all of these little slices of spectrum are licensed to people to use. And there are hundreds and probably thousands of these that are all being issued, and they're all in use by different people, by maritime radio, by mobile phone technology, by satellite TV, by digital TV, by the police, by the ambulance, by, aircraft, satellite communications, all sorts of things are all using the same bandwidth that we use for mobile phone. But again, campaigners are not campaigning against that, which is strange. Interestingly, which I'll very quickly, slight diversion, microwave ovens use 2400 megahertz, actually 2500, I should say, 2500 megahertz, which is in exactly the same sort of bandwidth as your mobile phone. So it jumps to the obvious conclusion, well, if a mobile phone can heat a tin of beans in a few minutes, what the hell is if a microwave oven is heating a tin of beans, what the hell is a mobile phone doing to my brain? Well, there's a good reason why a microwave oven can heat your beans and a mobile phone is not going to heat your beans. It's a thing called dielectric heating. It's a well understood process of radio waves. And what happens is, as the radio waves pass a particular molecule, so imagine a single molecule of water, because it's what's called a dipole, which it has its positive and negative, not in, I can't remember, two things either side are the same, I can't remember, but it can't spin on its axis properly. It tries to spin randomly. So because the radio waves affect those individual molecules, they cause them to move, and they start shaking and they start banging against each other. And it's simply the friction caused by those shaking molecules. All you're basically doing is taking a cup of water and shaking it very, 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 very quickly on a minute level, and that causes the heat. But the heating effect of a microwave is huge compared to the heating effect of a mobile phone. So a microwave puts out round about 700 watts per kilogram. So if you put a kilogram of water, which is a litre of water, inside a microwave, turned it on full blast for a minute, it would heat it by around about 8 degrees. If you put a mobile phone next to the same litre of water, it puts out 1 watt per kilogram, and the maximum by law is 2, but most of them put around 1, between 0.7 and 1.5. It will heat it, but almost immeasurably small. It is less than 0.01 degrees Celsius. It is very difficult to measure that at any real consistency. And so there is a heating effect. There's a tiny, tiny heating effect by the radio waves coming out of a mobile phone, but it is tiny, okay? So small that that sort of heating effect against your ear or your brain will soon be dissipated by your blood. You're going to get a lot more heating effect from just standing next to a radiator or standing with your hand out in sunlight. You're going to get that. And it's not as though we don't have a natural source of radio waves that exceed anything that we put out that's man-made. We have a large ball above our heads called the sun, which is putting out huge amounts of solar energy. Much of it in that dangerous ultraviolet that will cause cancer and cause burns, which is why you wear sunscreen, which is why you get sunburn, is because sunlight and the energy from the sun is thousands and thousands of times much higher energy than any mobile phone is going to put out. So if you're worried about 5G, you should be thousands of times more worried about the sun. And thank God we are worried about the sun. That's why we wear sun cream, as I said. There are other sources. Lightning strikes put out a lot of radio frequency. The Earth itself, which is mostly infrared, but some of that is radio frequency. So we're getting bombarded by this naturally all the time. It's just our ability to control and pick up a precise signal of radio waves, I think, is what is absolutely amazing. I would equate it to like being in the middle of a Led Zeppelin concert and hearing somebody whisper your name from the other end of the auditorium. We have the ability to do that. We're surrounded by radio frequency. We just have the ability to generate our own little bit of it and control it and understand it and use it. So just plotting the sun on our little spectrum chart there, you can see the sun is putting out a hell of a lot more energy at a much, much higher frequency, and it actually goes into ionizing radiation, so we know it's dangerous. So have we always been scared of radiation? Why are we scared of radiation radio waves? Well, we have been for quite some time. You go back to 1903, this is an article that appeared in the Los Angeles Daily Times. And it was a banquet, or probably a meeting of some sort. And they had a meeting in Los Angeles to talk about electricity and show up their theories by various machines, such as electrotherapeutics, X-rays, and so on. And interestingly, there was talk about radiophobia. So at the evening session, there were papers on radiophobia and radiomania by Dr. Albert Soyland of Los Angeles. So even in 1903, the phrase radiophobia, which is probably similar to what we're talking about, fears of Wi-Fi technology and radio frequency technology, was understood and known about. There were fears of it even then. But we've not always been scared of it. Absolutely, many people have embraced radio waves and electromagnetic waves in general. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we were making chocolate with radium in it. We were making cigarettes with radium in it. Suppositories with radio waves. Clothing with radio waves in them, or radioactive clothing to keep you warm on the ski slopes. Even, radioactive condoms. I'm not sure what benefit they gave you over standard condoms, but nonetheless, there were radioactive condoms available in the 1930s, which is kind of scary, really. And from there, if you go back to the 1980s, some of you may be old enough to remember the huge kerfuffle around power lines and why people were really scared about the electromagnetic fields coming from power lines, which seem to have died a death. Nobody seems to talk about that anymore. And then in November 1992, on the American TV show Larry King Live, they featured a guy called David Reynard. Now, David was the husband of a woman called Susie Reynard, who sadly died of a pretty rare brain cancer. She was quite young when she died. I think she was only in her 20s, possibly early 30s. And her husband claimed that it was because she used a mobile phone. Remember, this is 1992, so this would have been a fairly large mobile phone at the time. David Reynard accused the mobile networks in America of causing his wife's deaths, and he sued them. Eventually was thrown out, but it got a lot of publicity. And this is where the whole kerfuffle about mobile phones giving you brain cancer started. From this one court case, it became national news and national prominence, and then there was lots of fears about mobile phones give you brain cancer. From there, you've got things like smart meters, the whole kerfuffle on the internet about smart meters, about Wi-Fi, claims that plants won't grow near Wi-Fi routers. I've got news for you, they do. And of course, LED streetlights, which is what Mark Steele was talking about. It's a huge conspiracy of radio frequency waves that somehow networks and electricity companies and streetlight manufacturers are all trying to kill people, and it's impossible. Nobody seems to be consistent. Nobody seems to come up with a consistent idea of exactly what dangers Wi-Fi poses. There are lots and lots and lots of claims. There are hundreds and thousands of little studies that show, in vitro studies quite often that show, we held a mobile phone next to some cells from a kidney, from a human kidney or something like that, or from cells of chicken cells or embryos. And we found that 10 of them got cancer and 8 of them didn't. And that proves that it gives you... There are loads and loads of this, much like there are loads of studies that coffee gives you cancer or cures cancer. There are no decent, large studies with good quality that show there are any dangers from radio frequency radiation. None at all. So what does the good science actually say? Well, according to WHO, are we still trusting the WHO? I don't know. I lose track these days. But anyway, according to WHO, several years ago, they decided to put radio frequency waves, or mobile phone signals, Wi-Fi signals, TV signals, all the radio frequency waves. They said they were in group 2B, possibly carcinogenic to humans. Now, that caused a huge kerfuffle because, possibly that sounds like maybe, which sounds like, it should be wary. Wow, God, they're all going to die. So it got so bad that WHO had to put out a statement. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention that Group 2B also includes coconut oil, aloe vera, bitumen, pickle veg, and talcum powder. One of the problems is the WHO does not include dose size in their claims of possibly gives you cancer. For good or bad, that's how they classified it. So like anything, the dose is important, but even at high doses, there is no claim that there is no consistent demonstration that radio frequency causes cancer. They're just trying to be safe. But it got to the stage that WHO had to put out a press release, which basically said, excuse me, a large number of studies have been performed over the last 2 decades to assess whether mobile phones pose a potential health risk. Today, no adverse health effects have been established as being caused by mobile phone use. Pretty definitive, if you ask me. But I don't know whether we could trust WHO. Let's have a look at some studies, shall we? Well, what about a famous Danish study, which was published in 2007 and then updated in 2011? And they looked at 350,000 subscribers in Denmark, and they split them into people who'd had a phone before 1995 and people who didn't have a mobile phone before 1995. They had to take that year because after the mid-90s, almost everybody had a mobile phone. So they split them into 2 groups, 350,000 people. They found round about 2.9% of them got tumours of the central nervous system, which is bang on what you would expect. And the conclusion of the study was, in this update of large nationwide cohort study of mobile phone use, there was no increased risk of tumours of the central nervous system, providing little evidence for a causal association. So that's one study, 350,000 people, fairly big and fairly good study. Well, you want another one? Okay. How about Cancer Research UK on mobile phones and Wi-Fi and power lines? Now, they quoted the Million Women study, which was done by Oxford University. And they looked at 790,000 women, particularly for mobile phone use, and they found no link between the use of mobile phones and most types of brain tumour. There was also no increased risk for 18 other types of cancer. Okay, you want another study? How about the Interphone Study, which again was done by WHO? This concluded in 2014 that an interview-based case control study with 2,708 glioma and 2,409 meningioma cases. They conducted over 13 countries, and there was no increase in the risk of glioma or meningioma. And there were suggestions of an increased risk of glioma of the highest exposure levels, but biases on error prevent a causal interpretation. So that is the Interphone study, again, of over 5,000 people. Do you want another one? Okay, there's one that's currently ongoing by Imperial College in London. This is called the Cosmos Study, which is investigating the long-term health of mobile phone users. There's got 105,000 participants in the UK and 300,000 people taking part across Europe. And this is run until 2021. And it's been endorsed by the Department of Health, the Health Protection Agency, the World Health Organization, and various other bodies. So they've yet to obviously conclude their study. But from what I gather, they've not found any link either. But obviously, we need to wait and see exactly what they give. So all these studies clearly demonstrate there doesn't seem to be any link. And we've been using mobile phones for, 30 plus years. There's been no real demonstration of any harm. There are lots and lots of claims, but nothing ever seems to manifest or be demonstrated in any particular way. It's very difficult to pick out anything from all the noise out there. So just to conclude, just to sum up really what we talked about. So 5G is simply about the more efficient use of all the radio waves that we currently use. It's the same radio waves in 5G as it was on 4, 3, 2, and 1. It uses the same bandwidths, the same frequencies. It will use a higher bandwidth in coming years, but that's still well under any dangerous ionizing levels. And we've understood this stuff. Our scientists have been studying this stuff for well over 100 years, and they pretty much understand it. And the only demonstrable effect that we've ever managed to show is some localized heating, and that is really just dose and power specific. It's why they have a fence around the TV mast. It's not to stop you damaging it. Well, it is that as well, but it's also to stop people getting too close because it could cause them burns. And that's why they switch them off. It's why if you ever go to an airport and there's a big mast for the radar, they tell you not to stand in front of it because it could well cause some localized heating, could cause some local burns. And all these effects are constantly reviewed. I've shown you some studies. There are other studies out there as well, and they've been monitored for any adverse effects. I mean, believe me, it's in most health boards and health organizations' purview to find these problems, and they don't seem to find them. Why not? And it's not just in one country, it's all the countries. It's Europe, all across America, South America, Australia, Asia. Nobody seems to be finding any real effect. And all these studies show there are no increased risks with using mobile phones either. So to end, I'm just going to say, safe and happy mobile phone use. There are lots of ways to stay safe using mobile phones. It's not about making sure that you don't get radio frequency waves that fry your brains. It's about how you use that mobile phone and use it safely. So very quickly, number one, turn it off and on again. It's really simple. Like any laptop, any computer, anything like that, just try turning it off and on again. Okay, it works, and it really makes a difference. So about once a week, I would suggest you make sure you turn your mobile off and back on again. Number two, learn to back it up. In my job, I work in customer service, and I deal with a lot of people who phone me and say, I've got my new phone. How do I transfer things from my old phone to my new phone? Have you backed it up? So learn how to back it up. If you've got an Android or an iPhone, it's really, really easy. There are lots of just Google YouTube. Just look on YouTube. There are lots of videos that will help you learn how to back up your phone so you don't lose all your photos and your contacts that you've built up over the years. So learn how to do that, please. Thirdly, put a case and a screen protector on it. I know you've spent £1,000 on a shiny iPhone and you want to show it off to all your friends, but if you drop it, unless you've got insurance, you've just lost £1,000. You wouldn't wave £1,000 about in the pub and leave it on the table or something like you would with a mobile phone. So please look after it. Put a case and a screen protector on it. It might not stop it from every drop that you do, but it will stop it from some. And when you come to get rid of it at the end, you'll get a lot more money for it. So please do that. Keep it clean. Believe it or not, that picture is genuinely a phone that was returned to me by a leaver in the organisation that I work for. There's somebody who left the business, returned that phone for recycling and reuse in a state that was frankly bouffing, as we say in Scotland. It was terrible. It was horrible. I had to clean it. So please, I'm not going to ask any of you how many of you use the phone on the toilet. You know who you are. You know you do it. So you wash your hands when you come out the toilet, I hope. At least clean your screen. Most of them are fairly waterproof nowadays. You don't have, just get a towel or a tissue, give it a wee wipe. You should be cleaning it with some Windowline or some, window cleaning fluid. Just give it a little clean about once a week. Make sure you get a little pen and get all the gump out of those holes, especially the charger hole, by the way. On an iPhone, it's notorious for getting fluff in it from your pocket, and it'll stop it charging. So give that a poke around with a needle or a paper clip. And finally, the very most important thing you can do to keep yourself absolutely safe when using a mobile phone, the single most dangerous thing you can do with a mobile phone is to use it when you're driving. So please, don't use your phone when you're driving. Even with a hands-free car kit, it's still not 100% safe. It will distract you. But especially if you've not got a hands-free. It's illegal for a start. It's illegal for a good reason. Because it is fucking dangerous. So please, don't use your mobile phone when you're driving. So with that, I'm going to end my talk. I hope this has all worked. This is our first time that we've tried one of these. I can't say I was a little bit nervous doing this beforehand, but it seemed to go fairly well. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Heather, for that lovely introduction. And thanks, Flo, for managing the social media. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand you back to Heather. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Sean.
you very much,
So
Sean.
we're going to take a quick 10-minute break now, and then Sean will be back to answer your questions. So give us your questions either in the YouTube comments or on Twitter or any way you know how to get hold of us, even via email, and they'll get through to us and we can ask them, Sean, when he comes back in about 10 minutes. Thank you very much. So we're back. We've got a few questions come in. So, Sean, will Twitter's recent fact-checking of Donald Trump mean they'll have to intervene on these posts as well? And we've had a few questions around social media as well.
I wish they would. I wish social media would get more involved, because this is how these things spread. I'm all for free speech, and I'm all for people being able to express their views and opinions and all the rest of it. But there comes a point where some of these opinions and views are downright dangerous. If we're witnessed by, the burning of 5G masts and the number of groups. As I said, just go to your Facebook page now and just search for 5G groups. You will find hundreds of them. They're all spreading the same memes. They're all spreading the same bullshit information. And they couldn't do that in the past. I mean, it meant that a lot of this stuff is getting disseminated far wider than it ever should have done. So whether the social networks, they may manage to stop things like porn and nudity and all sorts of things like that, which I'm very grateful for. That's great that they stop these things. But why can't they stop this complete and utter bullshit as well? Because it's dangerous.
Well, a supplementary question from Links Chan on that theme is, would that backfire and feed the conspiracy further if they tried to clamp down?
I don't see how, because if the information is not getting disseminated, then it's not getting fed. You feed the trolls and they start spreading and spreading and spreading. So, yeah, there might be some initial pushback. I mean, look at the pushback from David Icke. David Icke is still on Twitter, and I happen to follow him on Twitter because I think we should. People like us should be following these people. And it talks about an awful lot of bullshit. But he's no longer on Facebook spreading that stuff because he's been kicked off. He's no longer on YouTube spreading that stuff because he's been kicked off. So it means that people who, not necessarily his followers, but people who might just come across it and think, that's that David Icke fella. I've heard about him. I'll bet it's funny. And then they'll get on and they'll start listening to him and start believing what he says, without any context to what he's saying or understanding of the wider problems of what he's saying, and the information is getting disseminated to people who perhaps are less able to discern what is reality from what is what isn't reality, and they make bad decisions and bad choices. That isn't to say they're bad people. They're not stupid people. They're just maybe falling down a rabbit hole that they don't understand. So if you cut that out, it helps. You look at some of the people who were chucked off Twitter in the early days of the alt-right. A lot of them now, you never hear from them anymore, which is great. They don't have a platform. Just deplatforming to an extent works.
Yeah, Alex Jones has really suffered being deplatformed, and then getting his house sued off. So hopefully he'll be poverty-stricken soon. Another joke from Links Chan. Also, will 6G lead to dysentery and cannibalism or Ebola? They just want to be ready.
Don't just shushed. We'll be doing
So these conspiracies, is it just that they tick so many boxes that you can come at it from any perspective and find a conspiracy that you're happy with? Big telco, technology being used against people, invasive government, health concerns is just a conspiracist's wet dream.
To an extent, yeah. A lot of these conspiracies all linked together. You've got things like, anti-vaxxers. You've got things like, from flat earthers all the way up to people who just think 9/11 there's something suspicious. Conspiracy theorists are not a homogenous mass. Lots of people have conspiratorial thinking within them. As a teenager, I was really interested in the JFK murder. I thought there was some wider conspiracy and all the rest of it because it was very fashionable to do that. So lots of people are fully capable of conspiratorial thinking. And with the 5G, it kind of ticks a lot of boxes, as you said, about the coronavirus, about big telco and tech giants and the fears of information technology being held by Facebook and Google and Microsoft and all these tech giants, and what are they doing with our information? We saw, your husband Mark will remember we went to see this guy called Ian Crane give a talk about 5G, who was a conspiracy theorist. And he talked not just about 5G, but about, self-driving cars and the dangers excuse me, the danger of those. He talked about our data being held by tech giants and used for nefarious purposes. It all kind of bundles into everything. It's fears of George Soros and Bill Gates and all these bogeymen that control the world, and the Illuminati. And there's a spectrum. Some are at the end of that spectrum, like Alex Jones, and some are not. But, it's a huge spectrum of people. And 5G just gets shoveled into the mix.
Another question from Vic Sprake. Are you aware of any studies on people claiming electrosensitivity as to whether they can detect if Wi-Fi, 4G, etc. is on or off?
I believe there are tests to do that. People have done those, but I don't know if there's been any systematic tests being published that I've found. I've not looked too deeply because I don't have access to journals and stuff like that. So if there are any scientists out there who know of these things, can they let me know? I'd be really appreciative. But as a simple test of on-off, if somebody claims they're sensitive to electromagnetic radiation, it's a really easy test to do. You can hold a mobile phone next to them, see if they sense it. You can control whether that's on or off. You could do double-blind studies quite easily by covering it up and giving it some...
Mark's just messaged me with something he found on PubMed, so I assume he'll post that on Twitter or something so everyone can see it.
Excellent. Thank you.
So Mark's doing the job. So is there any hope for getting the right information out there? Can we memify correct information as well as they can memify bollocks?
Isn't that the dream of skeptics groups everywhere?
Why haven't you done it, Sean? Fix it.
It's difficult, and some are better at it than others. Hopefully this talk helps to the several people watching now. Maybe they'll go out and fight the good fight and start spreading the facts about these things. God, that sounds so conspiratorial in itself. Do your own research, spread the facts. We all think we have the right information, don't we? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. You've seen earlier by some of those Facebook groups that have got thousands and thousands of followers. Skeptics groups up and down the country would kill for that. I don't know what the best way is. All we can do is do what we can do.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all we've got. Oh no, sorry, one in from Bryce now. Do you think that TV shows like The Gadget Show and BBC Click or national investigative journalism TV shows presenting the facts of 5G would do more to demystify the myths and understanding of 5Gs? So basically, could we get some light entertainment show to do a segment on it, and would that help?
Yeah, I mean, all these things help. The guy... Rory Cellan-Jones, I think it is, has been tweeting a lot. He's the journalist on BBC Click. He's been tweeting a lot about the bullshit on Glastonbury Council. For those of you who've not maybe followed the story, Glastonbury Council in Glastonbury is one of these areas that's got more crystal shops than food shops in it. It's just a weird place. So Glastonbury Council has been kind of overrun by a few people who think that crystals cure everything, and they're anti-5G, and they trying to stop 5G in the local area. And Rory Cellan-Jones has been doing great work in investigating these people and the reasons why, or the reasons for how they got on the council just to stop this. So journalists like that can really, really help. Most of you may have seen Better Call Saul, where they talked about radio frequency radiation fears. I think they did it in a fairly sensitive way, to be fair. I know pretty much, and I'm not going into the details if you've not seen the show, but there's one scene of a court case where it kind of comes to a head. But I think they did a fairly good a good portrayal of it. So yeah.
I think it's important for us as skeptics to remember, even if there's not physical suffering happening, psychological suffering is still suffering, and these people are in a pain of a sort and deserve sympathy, not dismissal. So
absolutely, there's sorry, just to clarify on that, it's important that we, as you say, we recognise that people are, their feelings are legitimate. They may feel they're in pain, and we have to recognise that and understand that and not dismiss. We can be critical of their conclusions as to what's causing that, but it doesn't mean to say they're not suffering in some way and deserve our respect and help, and not to be demeaned and dismissed as cranks or fools or idiots.
We've got another, I think, very tongue-in-cheek question from Tom Williamson. Which is better, Android or iOS?
Someone who has an iPhone and an iPad and
An
another
Apple Watch.
iPhone because it's my work one, and yeah,
And your watch?
I'm a watch, yes, and I do have an Android phone somewhere. Yes, I do have a Huawei ones, which is shit, and I hate it. So that answers your questions.
Your personal preference, and mine too.
Yes, I much prefer iOS.
All right, so I think that's all the questions that we've had come in. Is there anything that you would like to say before we finish?
No, just thank you, all the people that have watched. I hope you've got something out of it. Listening to me waffle on about 5G and mobile phones. It's one of the few things I seem to know a little bit more about than most other skeptics. So thanks for listening, and good night, and stay safe out there. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for listening. And again in a few weeks. Thank you very much.